You may think it rather nervy of me to devote this whole seminar to talking about nothing. But it's about space. And in most people's minds, space is nothing, unless it's filled with air. But once you get outside the air, space may be in some way crossed. By floating bodies, by various kinds of electrical vibrations, light waves, cosmic rays, etc.
Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of VOLIFE, hosted by me, Toby Ricketts, the video podcast and blog that tries to demystify and pull the curtain back behind some voiceover techniques, performance techniques, and technical ideas. So today I want to cover how to craft your audio so you can kind of put it in a space, make it stand out from other auditions. So I get asked quite a lot to audition for the part of Alan Watts. Alan Watts is very much in vogue, a British philosopher who did lots of seminars on kind of like the meaning of the self and stuff. Very compelling stuff, but it's being used frequently in advertising circles, such as this spot for Lexus, which I'm going to show you. We'll see how his voice is being used.
Let's suppose that you were able every night to dream any dream you wanted to dream. And that you could, for example, have the power within one night to dream 75 years of time. You would have every kind of pleasure. See?
So you can hear it's a kind of like English philosopher sort of university lecture kind of sound to it. But there's also technical considerations because he is speaking from another time, the 60s or 70s, recording equipment quite a lot different. So if you're ever asked to imitate basically a recording, then imitate the performance, but also try and imitate the technical sound of it as well. So what I'm going to show you today is how to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to record a passage from Mr. Watts, and then we're going to process it and put it in the right space. So we have a script in front of us, which is an excerpt from one of his lectures called The Power of Space Part 1, and I am going to open up Audition and start recording. So this is the performance aspect of it. So he's got a very kind of, English philosopher kind of a voice, very RP, very rounded, very, very, notice they very, very, it's the, what do they call it? I forget there's a name for that. I should know it, but I don't. Right, so this is The Power of Space. So here is my Alan Watts performance impression. And also, this is another performance note. He's not right on the mic. He's not in a studio on the mic like this. He's projecting from afar like this. So if you've got a directional microphone pointed in your general direction, stand back from the microphone and project, because that is what he is doing as well. Okay, let's have a go. You may think it rather nervy of me to devote this whole seminar to talking about nothing, but it's about space. And in most people's minds, space is nothing unless it's filled with air. But once you get outside the air, space may be in some way crossed by floating bodies, by various kinds of electrical vibrations, light waves, cosmic rays, etc. But since the Michelson-Morley experiment, which seemed to prove conclusively that there wasn't any such thing as ether, some kind of attenuating fluid through which light was propagated. I'm going to do that again. But since the Michelson-Morley experiment, which seemed to prove conclusively that there wasn't any such thing as ether, some kind of attenuated fluid through which light was propagated, space just isn't there. So that was okay performance-wise, a few retakes, but you get that in VoiceOver, as you guys will know. So I'll stop that recording in Audition. I'll share my screen in Audition with you so that you can see what I'm doing in there. Okay, let's have a listen back. So this is the performance aspect of it. So, right, so this is The Power of Space. So here, you may think it rather so we're starting there, and we'll cut out all of that beginning stuff. You may think it rather nervy of me to devote this whole seminar to talking about nothing. But I just increased the volume a little bit to get a bit more healthy gain. I'm going to do a little bit more, just so we're working with a slightly healthier waveform. It's about space. And in most people's minds, go through an edit space is nothing with air. But once you get mostly
But once
the
you get
beginnings of
outside, space
sentences.
may be in some way crossed by floating bodies, by various kinds of electrical vibrations, light waves, cosmic rays, etc. But since the Michelson-Morley experiment, which seemed to prove conclusively that there wasn't any such thing.
I went and redid this whole thing. You'll remember.
But since the Michelson-Morley experiment, which seemed to prove conclusively that there wasn't any such thing as ether, some kind of attenuated fluid through which light was propagated.
So now we have our piece of audio we're working with. So the first thing you'll notice about his recording, I'll just play back slightly again some of it.
Let's have a dream which isn't under control.
So modern equipment has high fidelity, which means that it picks up the whole human hearing range, 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, very clearly. But back in the day, it wasn't the case. So what we're going to do is we're going to simulate it being recorded, on tape. I'm going to do this with an FFT filter. And an FFT filter is basically like a graph of frequency versus how much sound gets through. It's basically a form of EQ, but it's a kind of a very harsh form of EQ. Like it's really like if you do a cliff edge like this, like here, the anything below 56.1 hertz is going to get cut completely. Whereas a parametric EQ will have a much softer kind of curve to it. And a graphic EQ still has a little bit of curve for each of those sliders. So this is like a real take no prisoners. But I find it really graphically useful to see exactly which frequency is being let in. So firstly, I'm just going to let everything through and we're going to play it back. And I'm going to start taking off bass frequencies and high frequencies because cassette tapes or reel-to-reel tapes back in the day weren't terribly good at picking up high frequencies. They tended to roll off on the top and you'd get this kind of muddy, kind of warmish top end instead of the kind of crisp recordings we have these days. So have a listen.
You may think it rather nervy of me to devote this whole seminar to talking about nothing, but it's about space. And in most people's minds, space is nothing unless it's filled with air.
So now you can hear
But once you get outside
it's rounded
air,
off.
Space may be in some way crossed by floating bodies, by various kinds of electrical vibrations, light waves, cosmic rays, etc. But since the Michelson-Morley experiment, which seemed to prove conclusively that there wasn't any such thing as ether.
Let's just pause that. So also there's I'm going to reduce the proximity effect. I'm still quite close to this microphone, so it's still picking up a lot of bass. So what I'm going to do is reduce some of that bass. Oops, swap that over again. I'm going to take it up to like 100 hertz. So basically going to sound a bit thin on the bottom end too.
Some kind of attenuated fluid through which light was propagated.
Need a bit more.
Space just isn't there.
Now, we don't want it sounded like it's completely like through a phone receiver.
You may think it rather nervy of me to devote this whole seminar to talking about nothing. But it's about space. And in most people's minds, space is nothing unless it's filled with air.
Tricky getting this bottom one right.
But once you get outside the air, space may be in some way crossed.
So that sounds pretty
good
to me.
By floating bodies. By various...
So that's sounding a bit more like your classic analog sort of tape sound. Then what tape also did was there was a natural form of compression with tape because it's magnetic particles all changing, not digital bits. There was a little bit of fluidity about how it actually recorded it. So levels weren't completely linear. Like when you talked loudly, it wasn't kind of as loud as it probably was in person. It was reduced a bit, just like the way compression does. So I'm going to add some compression here. I'm going to add kind of an unusual curve. So with compression, if you have a completely flat curve, nothing changes volume-wise. It's just right in the middle there. And it'll sound exactly as it did before.
You may think it rather nervy of me.
So what we're going to start doing is changing when input comes in and how it goes out. That's basically all that compression does. So we're going to put a few elbows in here, which will just raise the general level. So something coming at like minus 40 here is going to go out at minus 30. So it's going to be a 10 dB increase. But when we get up to the top, it'll be the same. So I'm going to reduce this just a little bit like that.
With this whole seminar to talking about nothing.
If you did this a lot,
but it's about
get rid of some of these splines.
People's minds.
Doing some funky stuff.
Space is nothing unless it's filled with air. But once you get outside the air, space may be in some way crossed.
So we're trying to
emulate
bodies, the tape curve.
By various kinds of electrical vibrations, light waves, cosmic rays, etc. But since the Michelson-Morley experiment, which seemed to prove conclusively that there wasn't any
It's a
such
bit
thing as
much.
ether, some kind of attenuated fluid through which light was propagated. Space just isn't there.
So I'm just trying to grab this point here. Let's give that one more play.
You may think it rather nervy of me to devote this whole seminar to talking about nothing.
So that's sounding good to me. So now we've got kind of a decent tape recording of him, you know, which is accurate to the time. I'm also going to go in and I'm just going to put a tiny bit of reverb because he is speaking in a room. He's not speaking in a completely soundproof studio like I am. So we are going to go up to reverb and just put a little studio reverb on there. The room size, we'll put the room size down to 60 because it's not a cathedral. And we're going to have the decay at like a second or less, basically. A few early reflections in there because it is a room. And we're just going to introduce a tiny bit. So I'll put it on up here so you can hear it first.
But it's about space.
So it sounds like it's in a
And
toilet
in most people's
there.
minds, space is
if we bring this down,
unless it's filled with air. But once you get outside the air, space may be in some way crossed.
So you hear how that's made it sound like he's in a space. It's not obvious at all. In fact, it just sounds like he's in some kind of, you know, lecture hall or something. So let's try it with and without and A/B it just to make sure it does sound right. I'll turn it off to start with.
But once you get outside the air,
Hang on.
space may be in some way crossed by floating bodies, by various kinds of electrical vibrations, light waves.
That sounds good to me. We're going to put that on. And then the last thing to bring this kind of into focus is with valve equipment, when you record, and also with tape to some extent, there's a little bit of distortion that gets added to the loudest parts. And I am going to add a special, it is in the menu here in Audition. We're going to add distortion. You don't usually want to add distortion to your audio, but today we're going to. Let's do a reset. So this is completely normal.
You may think it rather nervy of me
I'm
to
going to start
devote this
adding
whole
compression
seminar to
up
talking
here.
about nothing. But it's about space.
So that sounds horrible.
And in most people's minds,
if you just add a
space is
tiny bit
nothing
like this,
unless it's filled with air. But once you get outside the air, space may be
it
in
starts
some
to
way
sound like a
crossed
vintage recording.
by floating bodies, by various kinds of electrical vibrations, light waves, cosmic rays, etc. But since the Michelson-Morley experiment, which seemed to prove conclusively that there wasn't any such thing as ether, some kind of attenuated fluid through which light was propagated,
That's very
space
fuzzy.
just isn't there.
So it's kind of interesting.
You may think it rather nervy of me to devote this whole seminar to talking about nothing. But it's about space. And in most people's minds, space is
It's a bit too
nothing
much actually on that bottom
unless
end.
it's filled with air. But once you get outside the air, space may be in some way crossed by floating bodies, by various kinds of...
All right, so we've applied that. We've got a bit of distortion. And this is our finished Alan Watts. I might just, let's just hard limit that up so that it's got a more healthy level because it's still kind of small. It's floating around the sort of minus 12 dB. So let's hard limit it up by 6 dB just to get a bit of gain in there. Put the maximum amplitude at minus 0.1. That'll give us a healthier level without actually changing anything in terms of the compression and the sound. So let's hear that back.
You may think it rather nervy of me to devote this whole seminar to talking about nothing. But it's about space. And in most people's minds, space is nothing unless it's filled with air.
So I would, if I was taking this one step further, I would put a bit of room noise in there, a little bit of tape hiss or something. But that's sounding pretty good to me. It's sounding fairly authentic. So we've taken like a crystal clear, studio quality recording, and we've grubbed it up a little bit to make it sound like a vintage recording in the style of Alan Watts. So I hope that you have found this useful. And hopefully I'll do more videos like this that kind of peel the curtain back, give you a few tips to make your auditions stand out and to make you a better voiceover artist. So until next time on VO Life, Toby Ricketts signing off. Don't forget to subscribe.